right, so discussing how BCBAs view reinforcement versus punishment. When we conduct an FBA, or functional behavioral assessment, for an individual, right, we figure out why a behavior is occurring, and then we use that information to inform a behavioral intervention plan to decrease that behavior. What we always try to support are positive reinforcement and or planned ignoring strategies in our plan prior to even considering punishment, okay? Because those strategies will not only allow us to decrease behaviors by using planned ignoring strategies, that's something that we call extinction, okay? When we no longer provide reinforcement for a previously reinforced behavior. We will make a SAFMED card out of that shortly. But then we can also target behaviors that we want to increase and take the place of those negative behaviors. And that is so incredibly important, because if we don't replace that behavior with a positive behavior, what's going to happen? We're going to have those maladaptive behaviors sneak in, right? They'll find a way. Everyone always does. They'll start lying, they'll start stealing, they'll start running away, something else will come up. So we have to find a more appropriate functional behavior for them. For in the example that we were discussing, where we had a child who was hitting to get something from his brother or sister, in that example, we would probably, it's hard to ignore that behavior, right? But we would instruct that child to not give in, but instead call for the assistance of an adult, right? So he doesn't gain access to an item by hitting his brother or sister. And then the adult would ignore his aggressions. We wouldn't offer punishment for it, but instead we would immediately prompt him to do something more functionally appropriate, like using his words, okay? Or using a picture exchange, like, can I have a turn, my turn? And then the sibling gives him a turn with the item, and then they can go back. Obviously, in a perfect world, that could happen. Realistically, yeah, right, there would be a lot of pre-teaching that went into that, okay? So we would probably put in a program or two to target and isolate that skill of turn-taking, making requests of others, giving up an item too, so that when we put in that intervention, he's going to be more successful with it, okay? But that's always why we want to try to use positive reinforcement first. In some extreme cases, we will put punishment as a procedure immediately, but that's really only for behaviors that are very extreme and either are indicative of something that's going to be immediate danger to the individual themselves or the others around them. Otherwise, like I said, we try to use reinforcement first. So going back to that principle that we discussed, planned ignoring, which often ends up with what we call extinction of a behavior. I want to create that definition for you in your SAFMED cards, okay? So on one side, your term is going to be extinction. And then on the other, your definition is going to be no longer providing reinforcement for a previously reinforced behavior. All right. So one thing that I want to talk about more about with extinction is what typically happens. And you'll probably hear this at some point if you're working, you know, in the ABA field and you're dealing with behavioral intervention plans. Because reliably, there's an effect called an extinction burst that occurs when we implement a planned ignoring procedure, okay? So let's take, for example, let's take a pet, a dog, okay? We have a dog, and we'll do our behavior consequence here. So we've got our B and then our C. So our behavior is, or antecedent too. So our antecedent in this case is going to be you walk in the room. Dog whines. As a consequence, you give him a treat. In the future, more often when you walk in the room, probably particularly like the kitchen or the dining room table, the dog whines more often and he gets that treat. So this behavior of whining, or what we would call mooching, right, is how this is conditioned. So if we were going to implement a planned ignoring strategy, though, we would no longer provide reinforcement for this behavior. Our reinforcement here is in the consequence, right? So we're going to take that out. So now we're putting in our intervention. If we walk in room and the dog whines, I'm going to ignore / not give a treat. This is our intervention. All right, I'm going to draw you a brief graph down here so we can see what happens. All right, so we've got our axes here. And I'm going to say day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10. Okay. And then we're going to say minutes of whining. We're going to go up by 5. 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30. Goodness help you if they whine for more than 30 minutes. All right, so we've got our graph here, okay? I'm going to say days, and then minutes of whining over here. All right, so we'll say day 1, prior to you implementing the intervention, what the behavior originally looks like, also what we would call baseline, okay? What is occurring before we add any other variable to it, before we change the circumstances. So we'll say that on day 1, he's whining on average maybe, we'll say 20 minutes, okay? Then we decide we're going to put in our intervention. Phase change line there. Intervention. Okay. Day 2. He whines for, we'll say, 50 minutes. Day 3, he whines for like 2 hours. Then, all of a sudden, he whines maybe 25 minutes, and then 5 minutes, and then 0 minutes for the rest of the day, okay? All right. So, what we call this is our extinction burst, and it can reliably occur. And this is typically something that I inform parents prior to implementing the intervention, so they're not surprised when it happens and they don't think that the intervention isn't working. It's failing, this was worthless, right? Because it's a lot to deal with a behavior in home and to, gain the respect and confidence of our parents. So we want to make sure that we keep that as we go forward. And so that if we talk to them about this being documented and well researched effect that occurs when we start implementing this strategy, they're going to be much more comfortable with it when it happens. You say, nope, just bear with me. Remember, we talked about it. We can make it through this burst, and then it'll dramatically decrease, and we're good from there, okay? Because what happens is our dog, who is used to whining and getting food, is completely ignored. So he's going to say, oh shoot, maybe I have to try a little bit harder, right? So he tries a little bit harder, whines for a little bit longer, still no payout. All right, I'm going to try a little bit harder, right? So now he's panicking because what he was doing wasn't working before, so maybe he has to just do it more often or with a higher intensity. And then he realizes, shoot, this isn't paying out for me. So he stops trying. And then all of a sudden, you see the behavior dramatically decrease. And the same goes for our human clients, okay? But one variable in this example that we did not discuss, we implemented our planned ignoring strategy here, okay? But we didn't discuss an alternate behavior, a functionally equivalent behavior that we can increase to take the place of this. Because even though the dog whines here, you know, and we might be able to decrease it, he might all of a sudden start going into the kitchen and table surfing to get food, right, as his maladaptive behavior. He's going to go elsewhere. He might not be next to you whining anymore, but he's in the kitchen or he's going through the garbage looking for stuff. So what I might do in this example, okay, is I also put in another intervention. Where when I walk in the room, and the dog is quiet, I give him a treat. Okay? You have to be careful when you implement this because you don't want to accidentally reinforce a negative behavior. So typically you would figure out what a good length of time is. So maybe you initially walk in, the dog's quiet for 30 seconds. Good job laying down. Here's a treat, right? You wait another 30 seconds or so. Wow, nice job. Here's a treat. As long as he's not whining, you're going to reinforce his behavior. Because whichever of these you reinforce is going to happen more often. If you give him food after he whines, he's going to whine more. If you give him food after he's quiet, he's going to stay quiet more often. And this is actually a procedure that they use for dogs that bark, a shaping procedure, right? So they'll actually, especially, I don't know if you've heard of cases that have really severe separation anxiety. A dog trainer will actually come in and they'll put him in a kennel, very short period of time at first, and they'll reinforce even 2 seconds of being quiet in the cage. Here's a treat, and they'll let him out. They'll ask him to go back in, maybe 4 seconds. Here's a treat, let him back out, okay? All the way up until they can stay in that cage and they're quiet for minutes at a time, up to hours, and then you can leave him for a whole day and know that he's going to be quiet and comfortable because his behavior has been slowly shaped to be that way, okay? So we have to make sure that we're always equally reinforcing a more appropriate behavior, a positive target, if we are looking to decrease one as well. All right. This about wraps up our positive reinforcement versus punishment piece. So I will let you read that article and then we'll move on to why reinforcement is so important otherwise.